All right, well, hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to After the Vote, Recall Elections in California, hosted by California Humanities as part of our new initiative, California on the Ballot. My name is Kirsten Vega. I am the Program Associate at California Humanities. I manage the series, and I'm delighted to be joined today by our guests, Carla Marinucci, Seema Mehta, and Dan Schnur. In the political experiment that is the American Republic, California may be the most visible laboratory. What does the electoral history of a state, often considered to be the seat of the nation's social, technological, and cultural innovation, have to tell us about the future of American democracy? In California on the Ballot, a free series of virtual events, we reflect on what civic engagement currently looks like in California. We peer into the past, and we ask what changes might soon be in store. If you're not familiar with California Humanities, we are an independent nonprofit and partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities since 1975. We produce, fund, create, and support humanities-based projects and programs here in California in every congressional district. Before I turn the microphone over to our moderator, Dan Schnur, just a couple items of business. First of all, we'd love to hear from you during this session, so please do send us questions in the Q&A. The panel will take them on a rolling basis, and then we'll have some time at the end. If you also have an idea for a future California on the Ballot session, we would love to hear from you. You can send me a message in the chat or to my email that we'll post. California on the Ballot is made possible by funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of their More Perfect Union initiative. So I'd like to thank our funder, our panel, and my colleagues Renee, Cherie, and Julie Fry helping us out behind the scenes. And now to introduce Dan. Dan Schnur is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley's Institute of Government Studies, Pepperdine University's Graduate School of Public Policy, and the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Communications. Since 1996, he's taught courses in politics, communications, and leadership, alongside his work as a political strategist and commentator. Dan hosts a weekly webinar for the Los Angeles World Affairs Council Town Hall called Politics in the Age of Coronavirus, and you can catch it on Thursdays at 11 a.m. Pacific time. Welcome, Dan.
Kirsten, thank you so much for having me. And thanks so much to Julie Fry, to Renee, to Cherie, for the entire team at Cal Humanities. As all of you know, otherwise you wouldn't be here for today's program. It's such a terrific organization and does such wonderful work. And I know I speak for my colleagues on today's panel to tell all of you how happy we are to be here today with all of you, but in particular, how excited we are to be able to make a contribution to all the good work that this organization does on a regular basis. I'm going to introduce my two co-panelists, and then we're going to dig right into the discussion. And I will tell you, for those of you who are not familiar with Carla Marinucci or Seema Mehta, you're in for a treat, because Carla and Seema are two of the most accomplished and most respected journalists, not just in California, but two of the most impressive and well-regarded journalists, political journalists in the entire country. Seema is one of the lead political writers for the Los Angeles Times. Carla Marinucci, after many years at the San Francisco Chronicle, is their political editor, now heads California coverage for the Politico news site. And I can't think of two better people, not just to help us through a conversation about this year's recall election, but to think of for a little bit with all of you about where this recall and the sentiments that drove it, where that all places on the broader cultural and societal landscape here in California and across the country. I think one of the reasons that Seema and Carla and I were so excited about this conversation is lots of people, both during the recall campaign and after it ended, talked about what happened and who said what and what the polls showed at a certain time. And we'll talk about a little bit of that today for those of you who are into politics as much as we are. But this, or the real value of Cal Humanities, is we do try to look at these issues from a broader perspective. And we know that politics doesn't happen in a vacuum. but politics reflects culture and society, and sometimes it exaggerates it. And so what I want to do, rather than babbling on anymore, is I want to bring Carla and Seema into this conversation. And what we're going to do is we're going to split today's conversation into three parts. First, we're going to talk about the recall itself, because it was such a seminal event in California. Second, we'll address those broader concerns. And third, and most importantly, we want to hear from you. So in addition to taking questions as we can throughout the program, we're going to make sure to leave 10 or 15 minutes at the end, just so we can address as many of your questions as possible. So if we don't get to them right away, that's not because we're ignoring you. That means we want to save them for a big finish. So hang with us and we'll get to as many of them as possible. So Carla, I'm going to start with you. A year ago, the prospect of recalling look at me, the prospect of recalling Gavin Newsom, you know who's the old guy here, the prospect of recalling Gavin Newsom looked like a huge improbability. And I'm wondering if you could talk for a little bit about what created the landscape that allowed a recall election of Governor Gavin Newsom to move forward.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. A year ago, we were all saying, this is a long shot, never going to happen. It just seemed like an impossibility. But we got to remember, there's been 55 attempts to recall California governors in state history. This is a popular tool among the voters. And it was especially popular among those who didn't like Gavin Newsom. They tried 6 times before they got traction here. I mean, what we saw is, and I think Seema, you can bear with me on this one. We've got an increasingly sort of partisan, divisive political landscape that we're dealing with. And we've got activism on a local level like maybe we haven't seen before. These recall attempts coming back again and again. I see we're a manifestation of sort of a kind of a change in the political outlook from the grassroots perspective. People felt like they could do it. I mean, and of course, they had some unusual factors, and we can talk about those that got them past the finish line. But the fact is, I think what we've seen in the last couple of years is a new kind of activism, and some of it is on a very partisan level. Remember, though, a lot of the recall attempts here in California are at the local level. So this one at the gubernatorial level, I think, was so interesting because Gavin Newsom had just been elected by a 2/3, majority, a landslide, and yet began to immediately face recall attempts on him. Seema, go ahead. Your thoughts.
Well, I think one of the things we should remember is that every governor in modern history has faced recall attempts, and with the exception of the 2003 recall against Gray Davis, which made it to the ballot and was successful, but also featured a little-known movie star named Arnold Schwarzenegger, and this recall, none of the other ones have made it to the ballot. And I think that this is so as much as people talk about how easy it is to recall governors, really it's easy to launch recall attempts, but actually to make it to the ballot is not as easy as people pretend it is. And this one made it to the ballot because of sort of a perfect storm. And I know it's a big cliche, but it was sort of this perfect confluence of factors. Number one, we're in a global pandemic that none of us in our lifetimes have ever experienced before. And I hope to God, none of us in our lifetimes ever experience again. Number two, Newsom made some really stupid mistakes, French Laundry, that should, enough said. Number three, there was a judge who gave the signature gatherers an additional couple months to gather signatures at a time when schools were closed, businesses were closed, people were so frustrated. And that if they hadn't had that extra time, this would not have appeared on the ballot. So while you have to give the recall backers a lot of credit for being able to take what started off as a scrappy little effort that had no money, to turn that into this thing that had a lot of volunteers, a lot of energy, a lot of passion, you have to give them credit. But at the same time, there was all these factors that affected this that are the reason that it made the ballot, while when it wouldn't, and it hasn't in so many other circumstances in the past.
Yeah, and I think, Dan, that's kind of the interesting factor here, is that the recall proponents in this case, despite all the odds, despite all the naysaying on the pundits level, and many of us were saying, no way is this going to happen, they kept at it. And, as we said, 6 times. And I think that sort of reflects the fact that this tool, the recall tool, still has a lot of credibility with voters out there. They really believe that this is a check on elected officials. Whether you support what they did or not, the fact is that this tool isn't going away. And what Gavin Newsom faced was something, of course, the entire country watched, and he beat it back. But the fact is, he still had to work with it in a way that disrupted his governorship, and in many ways changed sort of the agenda at the top of the ticket in California.
And the fact that Democrats in such a blue state had to defend a governor seat that gave Republicans across the country glee. And the fact that Democratic donors spent like $100 million on this, that's money that could have been spent on House races next year. Like, that is a lot of donor money to spend in California.
So you guys are raising several really interesting points. And what you both touched on briefly, and I want to come back to it a little bit later, is the anger that not just voters, but so many people are feeling. And it's understandable, given, Seema, as you correctly pointed out, a once-in-a-century pandemic is going to make a lot of people frustrated and a lot of people angry. And they're going to look for targets at which to vent those emotions. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how this turned into the COVID election. It seems like unhappiness about COVID and the way the state handled it propelled it forward, but it also ended up providing a salvation for Governor Newsom, not as the politics changed, but as the world changed, didn't it?
And that was sort of the ironic thing at the end, because you're right, the thing that led to this recall happening was COVID, but the thing that saved him ultimately was his response to COVID. And that was not something that I think anybody could have predicted, because there was a lot of questions about his handling at times. At times he was being heralded as a leader. At times people were really questioning, the vaccine rollout. It was a roller coaster. It wasn't like any sort of straight trajectory. But at the end, if you look at his final message in the final months of the campaign, it was really like, if you elect any of these other people, people are going to die. I mean, it was that literal. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. It was like, literally, people will die if you do not keep me in office, which is not a message that I think I've ever heard before in any sort of campaign. And it's also very different than the campaigns, the politics we're seeing across the country, which is the total flip side, which is people, I'm sorry, you're probably hearing my cat in the background, which is people, basically saying, we're not going to have mandates. And that's what they're running on. So it does show how California is different from a lot of states.
Yeah. And I think you can't underestimate how much COVID shaped what we saw here in California, and how much it's shaping other recall attempts as well at the local level. But I mean, yeah, Seema's exactly right. It got him into this, not only with this French Laundry and the fact that COVID was the reason that the proponents got that 120-day extension on signature gathering that basically gave them the lifesaver that they needed. And at the end, it was the Delta variant. And Newsom's reaction to it, and the fact that he was getting it under control, and the contrast he could make to the Republican side, that was the key there. So in many ways, COVID was the key factor in this recall, and I think is going to be a key factor in other recall elections, other recall drives around California. The anger over mandates, mask mandates, vaccine mandates hasn't gone away. And I think we're going to see that manifested in other ways on the local level as well.
So what I hear you guys saying, and I don't want to sound like a one note on this, but to me, it's so fascinating the way you talk about the emotions underneath this. At the risk of oversimplifying, what I hear you saying is this started because one portion of the electorate was angry about the shutdowns and the measures the state was taking against COVID. And ultimately, the recall ended up failing because another cohort got angry at those people who refused to get vaccinated and led to the spread of the Delta variant. So two different types of anger directed at two different targets, one that started the recall, one that defeated it. Yeah.
And some very big differences between how Newsom calling for mask mandates, vaccine mandates, differed from the Republican side, all of them calling to roll those back. That allowed the governor to give voters a real choice on which way they wanted to go. And I think that his way was obviously much more popular with voters. So that was a big factor there, no question.
And the other factor that we have to mention is Larry Elder's entrance into the race, because before Newsom was sort of, fighting against this sort of amorphous Republican, it wasn't, once Larry Elder entered the race, he was able to make it like really a one-on-one contest with very sharp political differences, and including on COVID, but on many things. And that, I think, completely changed the trajectory of the race.
I think that's such an important point, Seema. One of the things we learn early in politics is that incumbents running for re-election, whether in a recall or a more conventional campaign, incumbents never want the election to be a referendum, an up or down vote. They want it to be a choice. Joe Biden, between themselves and their opponent. Joe Biden used to like to say earlier in his career, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And if you think about it, a recall almost by definition is a referendum. And what I hear you saying, Seema, is Newsom turned it from a referendum into a choice.
Right.
Saying you might not love the you might not love the stay-at-home or stay-at-home orders and the shutdowns, but do you really want what's going on in Florida and Texas instead?
Right. And you saw that in the polling, like before Elder got in the race, when he was still, sort of fighting against, or, trying to paint the rivals as whatever. You didn't see that sharp opposition from Democrats, or you saw opposition from Democrats, but you didn't see enthusiasm from Democrats. And then once he had an actual opponent that he could make it a one-on-one contest with, that's when you saw Democrats really get engaged. And that certainly made a difference, as well as the massive financial advantage that Newsom had.
Yeah. And we know that Newsom's strategy team, A. Smith, Sean Clegg et al., said from the beginning they were not going to make this about a referendum on Gavin Newsom. Remember that the original recall applications didn't even mention COVID. They were about things like immigration, high taxes, et cetera, illegal immigration, blah, blah, blah. In the end, that's what it became. They were able to go from making it about a Trump recall to making it about, as Seema said, a Larry Elder target. And that worked in their favor in every way. That said, I think, one of the things we should talk about is how these recalls affect the governorship in the sense of they end up derailing a lot of what's going on in the executive office. We saw that with Gray Davis, and we saw that with Gavin Newsom. When a governor is under a recall threat, business at the top stops in a lot of ways, and the governor becomes focused on one thing only, which is saving his or her skin. And whether that, and I think that that's an interesting outcome of this recall as well. We saw Gavin Newsom pivot from doing a lot of state business to really becoming focused on, going around the state and just focusing on this recall and focusing on, let's be honest, the people that were donating, some of the big donors, some of the big special interests who were backing him. He had to pay attention to that. And that happened to Gray Davis as well. These recalls have an effect that goes just beyond just the actual balloting that happens.
And every policy decision that's made is viewed through the lens of the recall. And, for example, the school mandate that came out recently, people were like, well, shocking, he didn't do that before the recall.
You're talking about the mandate for masks and vaccines.
Right, yeah. Okay. And then going against the prison guard vaccine mandate. The prison guards are huge donors. So, every decision is made looking at it through the lens of the recall.
Hey, Carla, you made a point in passing early on that I want to come back to. And you talked about how a governor's recall is not unique. And you've referred to recalls plural a few times now. It would be easy for us, but it would be a mistake for us to look at this purely as a partisan ideological trend.
Yeah.
That while the governor's recall was driven by conservative Republicans, not completely, but largely, this is becoming more and more commonplace around the state from all points on the ideological spectrum, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. When you're talking about some of the high-profile recalls we're looking at here in California right now, let's take the district attorneys in the two biggest cities, San Francisco and Los Angeles. Both of them under a recall threat right now. Remember, these were recalling district attorneys used to be rather rare. They were viewed as tough on crime folks, people who were like their public service in the interest. Well, now when both of these district attorneys were elected sort of in a more progressive sort of stance as people wanting criminal justice reform. And now even in some of these liberal bastions like San Francisco saying, maybe this has gone too far. The district attorney, Chesa Boudin, there having an unusual background as a public defender, et cetera. His family background has made national news. And even in San Francisco, a very liberal bastion, he's facing critiques. I think that's a fascinating outcome of sort of the recall fever in California, if you will. We just saw a Sonoma County DA just faced a recall. She beat it recently, but that also was about sort of anger over her performance. I mean, this is something we really kind of haven't seen before. School, they've always been there on a local level, school boards, et cetera. But as Seema said, it's not easy to get a recall on the ballot. And it's even harder to get one to pass. And we haven't seen that many, but the fact is these two DA recalls, George Gascon in Los Angeles, which is now ramping up again. They have a huge number of signatures they have to put together. I think it's 580,000. That is a lot of signatures. That's going to take a big event, a lot of activity to get that done. But you've got a bipartisan group there that says, and it is a bipartisan group that says they want to recall him. Of course, he's got big supporters as well. Chesa Boudin, similar in San Francisco. I think it's fascinating that these two big cities are both sort of looking at the same issue here.
I think we should also look at these school board recall elections. There's so many going on around the state. There was just one launched against a couple board members in Tustin Unified in Orange County. And a lot of this, not all of it, but a lot of it is over mask mandates, vaccine mandates. And something that might not be able to be accomplished statewide, given the state's Democratic tilt, it might be easier to accomplish in a school board or in these smaller jurisdictions, which might be more conservative, which might have, and then with mask mandates and with vaccine mandates, sometimes that can cut across party lines in terms of parents' frustration. So I think the number of school boards that we'll be looking at over the next year or two is going to be pretty remarkable.
And not just school boards, given the vaccine mandates, but of course, we're watching the San Francisco school board deal with this.
Huge. That's a huge one. And it's a fascinating one, just because the city landscape being what it is. Of course, the school board there made news with some like eye-opening, jaw-dropping actions, such as wanting to rename schools, Dianne Feinstein Elementary or middle school, whatever, and trying to take down major statutes without apparently some of them knowing the history of some of these major figures that they were calling to dump. That has created a huge controversy in San Francisco, and there's 3 members now that are facing recalls, and that is almost certainly going to go forward into the ballot. So interesting, even in a liberal community like San Francisco, it
definitely cuts both ways. I mean, it's not one side or the other. I mean, everyone, I think all voters seem to be really awakened to the idea of these powers that they've had for more than a century, or close to a century. They really seem to be awakened to using them.
The school boards, district attorneys, city councils, anger from the right, anger from the left, anger from the center. So here's my question. I realize, Kristen Vega always gets mad when I sound like the old 20th century guy in these conversations, but angry voters is nothing new.
No.
That's something that's existed as long as democracy. But at the risk of sounding like the old fogey here, that's why there are elections scheduled on a regular 2, 4, 6-year basis, depending on the office. I guess my question, whether it's from the left or the right, whether it's local or state, what is it, moving beyond politics into a broader conversation? Why are we so, the question isn't why we're so angry. The question is, why have we become so impatient that we can't just wait until the next election like we always used to?
Well, I ordered pet food from Chewy yesterday, and it arrived on my doorstep today, and I didn't have to go to the store this weekend to get it. And I know that's a really dumb answer, but I think part of it is we are used to getting whatever we want right now. And I think the pandemic spurred this on. And we see this with I live in Long Beach. We see this with all the cargo ships off the shore of Long Beach waiting to get into port. People are just used to getting stuff when they want it. And I think that's more so. And again, I'm going to sound like an old fogey, get off my lawn. I had to drive. I had to walk 5 miles to school uphill both ways. But I just do think we're a more demanding society than we were decades ago. And I also think we're a more polarized society, and we all know we're a more polarized society than we were decades ago. And I think those two factors combined really are driving people to try to act before the next election, even though we have such a history of, okay, you run an election, if you lose, you watch the guy's record or the gal's record for the next 4 years, and then you decide whether you want to oppose them or whether you're going to run somebody else. And that does seem to be viewed as sort of like a quaint thing of history. And honestly, I think if you look at the former president, his continued questioning of the propriety of the 2020 election, I think that also feeds into it as well. I think we can't ignore that.
So just real quick, Carla, if I can, because I think Seema's point is such an important one. This is why we're having a supply line crisis in the country, because we all during the pandemic became so used to ordering things that we wanted delivered the next day. So we're at a point now where the president is ordering the ports to stay open 24 hours a day, just so I can get my Amazon packages quickly as I want to. I know you guys are political experts, but you watch the broader cultural and society too. What drives this impatience?
I think you cannot discount the impact of social media on this. I mean, unlike the Gray Davis recall, Twitter didn't exist back then. Facebook didn't exist. Google didn't exist in that recall. And now we've got an atmosphere where overnight somebody can go viral. Somebody can put up a tweet that is the end of their political career, one tweet, and can fire up a movement. And people, and as we know, Facebook is, under fire right now in terms of the kind of organizations, grassroots organizations that are using Facebook, sometimes with false information. I think the questioning of the legitimacy of the elections is another factor. And I think all of this has come together in sort of, to use that cliche again, a perfect storm, in the sense of you've got groups, grassroots groups out there, and some questionable organizations like QAnon, which have been proponents of some of these recalls and have organizational platforms that just didn't exist, 20 years ago. And I think that has changed the landscape in a very big way. Social media has given a tool to activists for good or bad, in some cases, that is just an accelerant to a lot of these recall movements.
And you have outside actors who can use bots, et cetera, to make something look like a grassroots movement when it's not a grassroots movement. And I mean, I think there's always been opportunities for people to engage in inappropriate behavior, but now I think there's so many more opportunities, and it's also sometimes much harder to detect. And I think it's not just about recall elections; it's about all elections. This is something that I think everyone is trying to figure out how to deal with, or how to understand, how to cover, how to let voters know about.
Yeah, and one more. I was just going to say one more thing, Dan. Which I think we can't discount either, and that's the money, and particularly the dark money aspect of it. People can raise money now in ways that they were never able to do before, and in PACs and other ways that now also fuel these recall movements and fuel other issues as well. But there's an incentive, there's almost a financial incentive in some respects to put these committees out there, raise money, whether or not they're successful.
So what you're saying is everybody gets angry regardless of their income level. The difference is a really wealthy, angry person can spend their money to try to satisfy their anger. And I think we should also acknowledge, all three of us, for our audience, none of the three of us are druids. None of the three of us hate technology. I think we'd all agree that the benefits of the advances in communications technology, not just in politics, but in society, far outweigh the downsides. The empowerment that comes with these tools is extraordinary. But like Uncle Ben Parker said, with great power comes great responsibility. And just because we can act immediately doesn't necessarily mean that we should, whether it's writing the check, sending the tweet, or starting the recall. Seema, you alluded just briefly to a really important point earlier, and I want to come back to it because we were talking about immediacy. But you also mentioned, in addition to the immediacy that drives a lot of this anger is you talked about polarization. And I wonder if one of the other things driving the recall is that the stakes seem so much higher that waiting for 4 years seems less acceptable. In a bygone era, there I go again, in which the two parties would, at least on some occasions, work together. You might not love the fact that your candidate lost, but you'd know that you'd be part of the discussion over the next 2 or 4 years to come to policy outcomes. Now, if you know you're going to be completely shut out until the next election, you're a lot more incentivized to pursue a scorched earth approach, because it really has become all or nothing, hasn't it?
I mean, I don't want to have like wear rose-colored glasses or whatever that cliche is about the past. I mean, I recognize that there have always been, political differences, but it does feel like some of the agreements that were made in the past would be difficult to see today. If 2000 happened today, I don't know what would happen. If, God forbid, like 9/11 happened again, which I kind of pray to God doesn't, I don't know that, as a nation we'd be able to come together the same way. I don't even know that we'd be able to agree on the same set of facts the same way. And I think it's frightening, quite frankly, if we can't agree on, we as a country cannot agree on the same set of facts. But yeah, I think you're right. So if you don't think you can make any headway, when the opposing party, whether you're Republican, whether you're Democrat, if you don't think you can find any room for a common cause or common agreement, I do wonder if it does cause more, more motivation to try to change things right away. And I mean, and if you talk to people who back the recall, there's really a feeling like that the state is on a precipice, and that, the state's at a turning point where, like, if things are not turned around, the state is never going to be the same as it was again. And, it's like, I feel like we have to give those people, these people voices, to listen to their voices, because it's, there's millions of people who supported this. And so they are, but at the same time, there's many millions more who didn't. And then I just want to circle back on one thing you said earlier about, dark money and about money and politics in general. While it's true, we should, I think, look at the money in terms of the people who supported the recall and getting the signatures. We should also look at the millions that the governor received from a lot of people who have a lot of business in front of the state.
So, Carla, of the many really smart points that Seema just made, there was one particular phrase that leapt out at me. And that was the phrase, listen to them. Now let's agree that the them are those other people on the other side, right? Whether that happens to be blue or red or left or right. Seema makes a really good point. It's not like in the days of yore, the two sides marched arm in arm together. But it seems to me that the difference is that when it was necessary, whether it was 9/11 or urgent public policy, they were able to put aside their differences even temporarily in order to work together. I tell my students about Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan working together to save Social Security, or Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich working together to reform welfare. And they look at me as if I'm asking them about their favorite blacksmith. And they don't doubt me, but it seems historically irrelevant. The question I have for you, Carla, whether politically or more broadly, is why don't we listen to each other?
Yes, the point you're making, Dan, is really well taken. I mean, look at how even after the recall in 2003, Gray Davis cooperated with Arnold Schwarzenegger, has never said an ill word about him, as far as I can tell. Took the voters' response to that recall and accepted it, and worked with him on a transition. Whether we'd see that kind of thing today, I think is very interesting. Why is there so much political division, and how does it play out in these recalls? I think in a state, this is particularly interesting in a state like California, which is overwhelmingly blue. And that's the question, is where does that leave Republicans? As Seema said, they want to be listened to. They have a point of view. And yet, because they're in the minority in the state legislature and in every statewide office, I think there is frustration. And in many cases, I think grassroots activists feel this may be their only shot at keeping the elected officials honest, or keeping them on their toes, maybe. I mean, it is sort of a fear factor for elected officials that this tool exists, and they can't go too far without facing some kind of backlash from voters. And I think in a state like California, which is so overwhelmingly Democratic, this is an interesting issue for the future for the Republican Party, which is this the tool they're going to use? Are they going to do other things to grow their field? or is this the best way for them, at least, to get some kind of a message or hold elected officials' feet to the fire? I think that's going to be an interesting thing to see.
If I could just point to that, like, we have to remember 6 million Californians voted for Donald Trump. That is not a small number of people. That is more than in many, many other states. So while people love to paint California, if you look at its leadership, it is very blue. And people, politicians across the country love to paint California as so democratic, but it's a huge state, and there are a lot of Republicans here, and they're Californians just as much as the Democratic Californians are. So I think, like, their concerns, whether it's our reporting or governance, we need to talk to everybody. And I think we both try to. And then the other thing I was thinking back to this ad. I think it was an ad, and Carla, correct me if I'm wrong, or Dan, during COVID about vaccinations, and it featured Schwarzenegger, Gray Davis, Newsom, Jerry Brown, and Pete Wilson. Am I remembering this correctly?
Yeah.
A reminder of that sort of that parties both, even though they don't agree on policy at all, working together sometimes for the greater good.
I think it's going to be interesting. One of the things that came out of this recall, we've seen Gavin Newsom a couple of times in tours around the state say, "I hear you. If you voted for the recall, I hear you. You are not, I am going to listen to you. I'm going to reach out to you." And I think we're going to see, is that going to happen? Is there going to be a sort of effect of this recall? Does he just go to Fresno and the Central Valley? Remember, there were, I think, more than a dozen counties that voted for the recall overall, small, rural mostly. But the fact is they exist. It's a big geographic part of California. And the question is, do elected officials listen to those voices? Does it have some kind of a check and balance effect? I think we're gonna be watching that to see if that happens or not.
I think that's such an important point, Carla. And if one good thing that could have come out of that recall election, whether you voted for it or against it, is after it ended, the governor went to Fresno, to the Central Valley, to the core of the opposition, and said, "I'm here and I keep coming back and I want to talk to you." That can't help but to be an encouraging thing. It's why you talk about the divisions. You both may have seen it, and some of our audience may have also, but the Pew Charitable Trust did some polling not too long ago. And they found that in 2020, 2021, more Americans than at any time in our nation's or in the world's history said that they were comfortable with a member of their own family marrying someone from a different race or ethnic or religious heritage. But the number of Americans who were comfortable with a family member marrying someone from the other political party was now at an all-time low.
Right.
And so when you guys talk about listening to everyone, talking to them, it's those kind of conversations, whether in politics or more broadly, that allows some of those divisions to be healed. One other thing I wanted to talk about on this before we start delving through our audience questions is Carla, from the very beginning, you started out talking about the voter anger, and and Seema, you talked about it as well. We talked about the immediacy of being able to express that anger. We talk about the polarization that drives it and may raise the stakes for the most committed partisans on both sides. One of the things I know you both thought a lot about also is something else that drives this disassociation is how transient California's population is, and how much more likely Americans are to live in different places than where they grew up, than previous generations were. If the three of us grew up in the same neighborhood and knew each other throughout school and our adult lives, even if we happened to vote for different candidates, we still have a lifetime of common memories on which to base a relationship. But if I don't know the people who live on either side of me, or they just moved in last year or the year before, I don't have those bonds. When we don't know each other as well, when our communities aren't as tightly bound, what does that do to our politics?
That is exactly the issue for California. I mean, as we've said it many times, and Gavin Newsom has said it too. I mean, we are not a coast, we're a country. We're bigger than, is it 23 other states? Seema, I think he said he's in population. Yeah, I mean, this creates challenges that no other state faces. When you talk about, let's take the recall of Gascon in LA needing 580,000 signatures. That is more than Scott Walker. They needed to recall Scott Walker. I mean,
in the state of Wisconsin.
Yeah, yes, that's right. I mean, those are the kind of numbers, those are the kind of population figures that create challenges. You're right. The number of newcomers. I think were any of us born in California? I wasn't. I mean, we're all, many of us are
Well, expats.
right, exactly. So because of this, yeah, this isn't Idaho. This isn't, we're not a state where, you can go to the state house and walk in and see the governor sitting. I mean, that in itself creates issues in California that are challenges beyond what other states have. And I think it's something, that's why I think when we come to the politics of recall, a lot of it is local. It still remains local on every level. When you talk about the hundreds of recall attempts in California, most of them are at that local level. Only 2, as we know, have gotten to the gubernatorial level.
I mean, I think one of the things we know is whether it's in terms of divisions over race or religion or same-sex, marriage preferences, that kind of thing. Once people get to know people who are not necessarily like themselves, they sometimes change. They're more likely to change their position. It's like people are not going to change their positions based on what they see on the news or necessarily what article they read in the newspaper. They're going to change. And I'm speaking, this is anecdotal, but from family members' experiences, it's from the family that moves across the street and getting to know them. And I wonder if that happens as much when we are such a transient population. We're not. A place where I don't think none of our families have had people in California for decades or generations, even though we have in other parts of the country. So I think that transigence may cuts down on that ability to form these bonds. And again, to what what Dan said earlier, if you look at your friends on Facebook, again, this is dumb, but you have people who totally disagree with you, to say things that in your eyes you view as completely moronic, but you're friends with them because you went to, you remember going to elementary school and sharing lunch with them. And that sort of supersedes like the political divisions. And when you don't have that, I think, I do wonder how harmful that is. Also, you have a lot of people who don't remember the 2003 recall.
That's right.
California is such a young population in addition to being very transitant. So I think this is all new to some people who, who have moved here recently or who are younger, who are like, wow, this is something cool new we can do in democracy. So I think all of that can feed into it.
Well, we have a ton of questions that have come in from our audience, and not surprisingly, given this is California Humanities, they're really, really smart, intelligent questions. I'm going to address one really quickly, and then I'm going to turn to you guys because we've had a number of questions come in about possible changes to the recall process, whether at the state or local level going forward. But just to start with, we've been asked, where did this come from? This whole idea of recalling an office holder in the middle of their term. And what I think some of you know, but just to take a minute on it, is back in the early 20th century, when California state politics and the state of California was dominated by another set of special interests, primarily the railroads. Hiram Johnson, one of the state's most respected governors, as a populist, stood up and said, the way to take state government back from the special interests is to empower the people. And his reforms included 3 measures, of which we're all familiar. One is the ballot initiative, the idea that we can pass public policy at the ballot if the legislature can't or won't. The second is the referendum, which can repeal or reverse a law passed by the legislature and signed by the governor. And the third is the recall. And so for the better part of almost a century, these were fairly ignored tools that were there if we needed them. But generally the thought of the public was, don't break glass unless emergency. And in recent years, in recent decades, we've begun to break that glass more and more frequently. So this is part of this,
but just to say this as a matter of LA pride, I don't know if pride or shame, I don't know which one, but he actually stole the idea from LA, which is where the recall first happened, by a man whose name is escaping me, but was like sort of a landowner, gentry doctor type, good government type, who started in Los Angeles like a couple or several years before Walker adopted it.
Well, and of course, this is all 3 of these tools have been employed more and more frequently in recent years. And when they were developed for the first time in the early 20th century, there was no Twitter, there was no social media. The amount of money spent on campaigns was much, much less. So here we are, a century plus later. Question for either of you is, is the recall process working the way that it should? And I know there's been a lot of discussion, which perhaps you can share with us, about possible reforms to the recall process, and how likely do you think those changes are?
Well, just to go to your point on history, I think that it's important. Hiram Johnson's reforms, I think he called it the gun behind the wall. I mean, that is the way to keep elected officials in check. And I think those reforms and Californians, just historic support of those reforms, it's because we're used to the direct democracy here. Initiative process, referendum process, and recall process have been part of the landscape here for a long, long time. So yes, that is why I think when every poll shows these aren't going away. The recall process is not going away, but should it be reformed? Yes. And Little Hoover Commission today took up its first hearing on this, on what should be some of these reforms. And I think everybody agrees, look, this is now an expensive process. Unlike the days of Hiram Johnson, when you're talking about a process that cost almost $300 million this last recall, people are talking about, look, what should be done to reform this, particularly at the gubernatorial level. I'm not sure the calls for reform are so strong at the local level on school boards and so forth, but at the gubernatorial level, I think the biggest issue and the reason there were so many national headlines and those kind of crazy California stories is the clown car aspect of the recall process at the gubernatorial level. The fact that there can be dozens of candidates who are, many of whom, they may be well-meaning, but they're totally unqualified to be governor. And that it is so easy for them to put their name in front of 22 million voters in a voter guide, $4,000 or 7,000 signatures this time around, nothing compared to the kind of advertising cost. So I think that's where it starts. The clown car aspect was the thing national media went insane about in the 2003 recall, and even in this recall. We didn't have a porn star this time, but we had some, we still had some interesting candidates.
For the record, you looked a bit disappointed to say that, Carla, but I won't try there. Seema, how about you? What are the prospects? What's the likelihood?
There's a number of different reforms that are being discussed, but I am skeptical about what will eventually happen. As Carla said, I mean, I think if you look at the polling, it shows that people support modifying the process, not getting rid of it. Some of the things that have been discussed are raising the signature threshold, maybe only allowing recalls in cases of like malfeasance or criminal activity. If a recall is successful, having the lieutenant governor take up the post, or if a recall is successful, then having a separate election on another day among the candidates who want to run against the governor, or allowing the governor to run on the replacement ballot. All of these things have I think people view them as having their pluses and minuses. The last one with having the two separate elections would increase what was a $300 million election to a $600 million election. So that seems a little problematic. But that said, I mean, these are all out there, but this is enshrined in the California Constitution. So any major change that needs to be made would have to be eventually taken to the voters, either through the legislature acting or through signature gathering. And then even though voters are supportive of reforming the process, once you go in front of the voters, asking them to take back power, I think it's a little bit more questionable. So I don't think even though there's a lot of anger on the Democratic side right now, I don't think it's as easy as people necessarily portraying it in terms of the fixes. I think it's sort of a drawn out process, and it's asking voters to give up power.
I think that's a really, really good point, Seema. Voters are frustrated, not just by the recall process, but the ballot initiative process too. But woe to that person who tries to take it away from them.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they might not like it, but they relish having that authority if and when they feel like they need it. So the challenge, it seems to me, for the reformers is how to convince voters that their power is not being weakened, but being strengthened and focused and targeted by those reforms. Because the natural instinct of many voters is, I don't love the fact that I have to do this, but I want to be able to if I need to. So don't mess with me.
Yeah, if people don't know about ballot measures, they vote no on it. Like we all know that. So they'd have to get some money behind it. And next year it's a huge race in terms of the House. So do you get donors to line up behind something that I think the whole thing it'll be interesting to watch.
I think one of the things that we're seeing talked about a lot is, and it was noted so much in this recall that California has the lowest threshold of the 19 states that allow for gubernatorial recall. California the 12% of ballots cast in the last governor's race is a very low threshold, and people are talking about maybe that needs to be upped to measure registered voters, not just those who cast ballots in the last gubernatorial election. On the issue of malfeasance, that's another area where very few states allow that. Some people have said instead of allowing gubernatorial replacements to get on the ballot with just signatures or just paying the $4,000, that there should be a number of signatures allowed. I think Gary South is one of the ones who has talked about that. And there is a debate about whether, some states, there's a couple of states that allow the lieutenant governor to take over if a governor is recalled. Lieutenant Governor Eleni Koulianakis here has spoken out against that, saying that it could create, let's say, a little drama, depending on who wants to. Remember, here in California, the lieutenant governor and the governor have not always been of the same party, and that could create a.
Even when they are in the same party, if we look back at Gray Davis and in 2003. So.
And Jerry Brown and Gavin Newsom didn't.
Right.
And two brute kind of thing, where you're wondering where the knives are. So it could be there's a lot of choices here. And I think we're looking at a situation now where you not only have the Little Hoover Commission, you've got state legislators who are now going to hold hearings on this. It is, Dan, what you said about the power and influence of the voters, but it's also about making the process more efficient. And I think what we've seen in this last one, when you have dozens and dozens of candidates, and as Seema said, maybe it's about having another ballot, or maybe it's about having ranked choice voting. That's another possibility. That all of these things should be looked at to make this process more efficient, because when you're talking about $300 million in costs, that's got to be.
And the other thing we didn't mention is that voters were super confused by this. I have gotten more questions and more emails and more social media posts about, like, how do I vote on this? If I vote no on number one, and I vote for somebody on number two, does that negate my vote on number one? I think this confusion was in part made worse by the Newsom campaign, which with their message of voting no on number one and leaving question two blank. But voters were really, really confused about this. And I think, I wonder if there's a way to simplify it so it's not as that makes it easier for voters.
Yeah, some people have also suggested, by the way, copying a system used in Idaho, which is to recall somebody there, the vote has to surpass the number of ballots that the official received when he won the election. That was one of the concerns, and that's why we got a lot of questions, as Seema notes, like, who do I vote for? Do I vote for a replacement, etc. That was one of the concerns, and Gray Davis has raised this concern, saying that it is only a matter of time that California is playing Russian roulette, essentially, that sooner or later under this system, someone will be elected governor with far fewer votes than the governor who's been recalled. So concern there as well.
Right, you have like people like raising this issue, and I mean, it seems like a prime legal issue.
Guys, we only have a few minutes left. And I'm looking at the questions. We've addressed a lot of the broader ones, but there's a lot of questions that came in early when we were talking about this particular recall election itself. So I'm wondering if we can circle all the way back to the specifics of this election. A few questions about the nature of the vote. Obviously, the recall was defeated by a sizable margin. You mentioned geographically that there's some areas that were much more likely to oppose it. I'm wondering whether geographically or demographically or from a partisan standpoint, there are any lessons that we can learn from the way the vote came down on the recall.
I mean, Democrats went home, and that's what happened. The Democrats who were sort of apathetic during the summer decided to vote. I think either because of the Newsom campaign's use of Larry Elder as a target, or the tens of millions of dollars they spent in August prodding these people to the polls. But there is some weakness, while Newsom, survived by a notable margin, he had some weakness among Latino voters, he had some weakness among young voters. These are two groups that are notoriously sort of difficult to turn out in non-presidential elections, but given how much money and focus was spent on that, I think that's something that, Democrats should be a little bit worried about or should be looking at. Those were sort of a couple of my takeaways.
Carla?
Yeah, and I mean, when we saw the split, Dan, red California versus blue California, rural versus urban California, and that's where a lot of that came down, and that's being reflected in some of the recall attempts we're seeing right now in California as well. I mean, we've got a recall attempt near Fresno, that in Kingsburg, where a city council member is being accused of being a Marxist, socialist agenda, AOC kind of person. That's going on. Shasta County, same thing. Anger over COVID. So these things are sort of breaking down the same way. And that recall, I think, reflected that split in California. A lot of those same sort of state of Jefferson state areas of California that didn't like Gavin Newsom, that didn't vote for him in the beginning, that voted for Trump in the 2020 election. That was reflected in the recall vote.
Boy, it's and one question came in specifically about the Asian Pacific vote, and I'll just tell the questioner that, like other communities of color, the APIA community did vote against the recall by a larger margin than the overall electorate, but not by the same margin as African American or Latino voters. One other question that came up a couple times is, we talked about Larry Elder earlier, and obviously there's no way of knowing whether he will run for governor next year. But there were several Republicans in the race, others who thought about it and who didn't run, not asking for predictions on the outcome of next year's governor's race, which is now only 12 and a half short months away. But are there Republicans on the horizon, either those who ran or those who did not, who may be positioned to give Newsom a competitive race? Or is California so deep blue at this point that after surviving the recall, the governor is fairly safe for another term?
Go ahead.
Make a prediction again.
Go ahead.
After 2016, I said I'd never make a prediction again. So
I think
there are Republicans who want to run.
Yeah.
We shall see what happens in the next year.
I think, as Seema said, you can never predict California politics. There is a debate over whether this recall attempt really kind of destroyed or hurt some of the Republicans who may have been contenders. Certainly Mayor Kevin Falconer, former mayor, doesn't think his chances have been heard, thinks that he still has a chance to make a case to voters, even though he came in, with what is it, 3 or 4% in this recall vote. But the fact is, I don't think you can predict, as Seema said, you can't predict anything. We don't know what's around the bend when it comes to COVID or other issues.
I would have predicted that.
Yeah,
I would have predicted that we'd be doing this by Zoom, a year and a half into this. So yes, we don't know. But I think, Carla's really right to bring up Kevin Faulconer, because for so long he's been written about as like, if the Republican Party has a candidate who can get elected statewide, this is the guy. And his failure to excite the base and his, coming in at single digits, I think that was a wake-up call for some Republicans. I don't know. I mean, the question is what the party decides to do. Do they pursue the path of a Larry Elder, or do they pursue the path of a Kevin Faulconer? And I think that's one of the
and I think this is where
and Seema's just absolutely nailed it. To me, this is the constant challenge of both major political parties. A successful party needs to both excite its base, whether it's conservatives or progressives, and reach out beyond its base. Larry Elder excites the Republican base, but doesn't help them reach beyond it. Faulconer might be in a better position to help them reach beyond that base, but doesn't excite it, as you guys just said. And Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders could have had the exact same discussion a year ago on that dynamic. That's just one of the fascinating things about the two-party system. There was also a question, which we won't have a chance to talk about, at least on this program, about whether Newsom might face a Democratic primary opponent. And I didn't know that former Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa was a member of this organization, but I suspect he asked the question under a pseudonym. And there will continue to be questions about whether he or another Democrat does challenge Newsom from the left. Very adroit question. But we're at 5 o'clock. We know that many of you in about an hour are going to be watching the 5th game of the Dodger-Giants playoffs, or if you prefer, of the Giants-Dodgers playoffs. But in either case, we want to thank all of you for being with us today for this conversation. I think you'd agree with me, as I said earlier, that Seema Mehta and Carla Marinucci are two of the best, are absolutely fascinating. So please join me if you can in the chat room, or with your reaction button, to thank them for leading us through such a terrific conversation. Carla, Seema, thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Dan. Thank you, Dan, for a great discussion. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks once again to
Thanks for
Kirsten
calling me.
Vega, to Julie Fry, to Kirsten Vega, to Renee, to Cherie, to the whole team at California Humanities, not just for today's program, but for all the amazing work you do. And most importantly, thanks to all of you who joined us today for this conversation. We'll hope to see you again in the future.